Good morning. I've just been briefing the Security Council on the humanitarian situation in Northern Sri Lanka, which, as you know, has deteriorated very severely in the last few weeks and months because of the continuing fighting there and the way in which the government has been pushing the LTTE and the civilian population them into an increasingly small pocket. So there are extreme concerns about the safety of the civilians in that pocket, concerns about civilian casualties, concerns about humanitarian access to them and humanitarian relief supplies for them. That is the top concern we have, which is one of the main reasons I went there myself last week to talk to the government about that and to try to make sure that they were doing everything they could to protect the civilians there, to allow them to get help and to prevent further civilian casualties. The other area of particular concern is the treatment of those who've escaped from this fighting and are therefore put in either transit centres in Vavunia, a town at the edge of the formerly LTTE-held area, or are being moved progressively to a new camp being set up a few kilometres away. I visited those camps. I was able to see the conditions for myself and talk to a large number of people, not only the IDPs themselves, but in some ways, more importantly, the people actually doing the work, the UN agencies and NGO humanitarian workers who have full access to those camps there about the conditions that they have there. I think in general the physical conditions in which they are being held are satisfactory, although there is a serious problem of overcrowding in some of the transit centres, which I hope will resolve soon. The biggest concern is about lack of freedom of movement for the IDPs. The government have concerns about security, which one can understand, but I made clear to them while I was there that having the military inside these camps and preventing the IDPs inside the camps from moving around, preventing access not by humanitarian agencies who do have free access, but access, for example, by relatives from the outside, is not acceptable on any long-term basis, and they therefore need to move towards freedom of movement for the camps and make sure that all the screening processes and so on are as transparent as they can be. So those are the main areas of concern which I was briefing the Council about this morning, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
John, you don't seem to sort of say there's any dire situation, a threat in terms of nutrition, sanitation. Is there a threat of any kind of disease or malnutrition? How sort of in those kinds of terms would you describe the situation and what might happen or is happening?
Well, I think you need to distinguish two groups. So the group who is trapped with the LTT in this rapidly shrinking pocket of land, and in particular being squeezed into the so-called no-fire zone on the coast. And they, I think, are increasingly vulnerable to disease, or increasingly vulnerable to nutrition problems and a lot of other problems, because the supplies of food and clean water and proper shelter are simply not there. Supplies are beginning to arrive using boats bringing it in because they're able to land on the beaches, but logistically it's quite difficult. It's difficult to get enough in. So I think there is genuine problems about their physical condition of that group, which is the numbers of that group are unclear. There's something between 70,000 according to the government, 200,000 according to our own estimates, 300,000 plus according to Tamil groups. But whatever the number, they're not only in grave danger because of the casualties which are occurring on a daily basis, but also because of their physical conditions. I think the ones in the transit centres and the longer-term camp are being treated reasonably well physically. They're exhausted from their ordeal. But they have food, I think they have water. So I don't think that is a problem for those. The problem for those people in those camps is more the freedom of movement issue and the armed nature of the camps.
Well, just to clarify, the people who are trapped, the concerns you're talking about are some things that might happen in the future that aren't really happening now in terms of the disease or outbreak of any kind of...
I'm not aware of of a major outbreak of disease, but I think we've heard from those who are in with them. We don't have direct access to those people, but those who are with them, doctors who are there, that indeed the incidence of disease is increasing, the usual kind of things that we get in these situations, diarrhea and so on. So there are problems which do need to be resolved by getting more food and medical supplies in there as soon as possible, and that's something I pressed on the government very hard.
Doctors Without Borders put out a field report yesterday about people that are trapped in the conflict zone, and when they leave, they've been without food and water for some time. When they leave, getting actually bombed and killed. I believe that you said that the government has stopped using heavy weapons. Can you verify that?
Well, I'm afraid we can't verify that. They assured me at every level that they had virtually stopped using heavy weapons. And that indeed they were taking more casualties as a result of that, but I can't verify that. It's simply unclear how far that's true. What seems to be true is that the civilian casualties are continuing to occur. It's very hard to distinguish civilians from LTTE cadres in some cases, but I've talked about dozens a day being killed and more being injured, and I think that's still the case.
And one follow-up. It was reported that during your trip, that at least in one instance in Vuvunia, that you used a government minister, I guess, of resettlement as your translator. Did you feel comfortable with that? Some there raised thought that maybe you didn't get the full picture. And also, is UN money going to be used for these camps in which people would be detained against their will?
On the first point, this was a very carefully arranged government visit to the camps, and therefore the IDPs to whom I spoke, inevitably faced with two government ministers, a lot of people in uniform with guns, television cameras. These were not very private conversations. Different people translated for me at different times, and including on one occasion the Minister for Resettlement. But I don't have any. In these circumstances, you have to give me enough credit with enough intelligence and insight to know when people are going to tell you the absolute truth and when they're not. But as I say, as well as talking to the IDPs themselves, I was able to talk to all the people who are working with them and to pick up what their genuine concerns were. And their concerns, as I say, are really about freedom of movement and not about the treatment, the physical treatment they're getting inside the camps. And the important point is that these should not be long-term camps. The government assured me that they wanted to get people back to their villages of origin as soon as they possibly could. They made a public promise that 80% of them would get back to where they came from by the end of 2009, assuming the necessary demining could be then. They pointed to the example of the East, where they did manage to get people back very quickly. We will have to monitor all these assurances very carefully to make sure they're implemented in practice.
On your visit to Colombia, what was your assessment of the situation of the internally displaced, and were you happy with the response of the government, how the government is working on this issue?
I think the government has put in place a good legal framework for the internally displaced and has been devoting increasing resources to them. I think the resources devoted to them has increased from $40 million to $500 million in recent years. At the same time, the numbers are very great, even by the government's own figures, which is to some extent disputed. As you know, there are 2.6 million displaced people in Colombia, and it's clear that they still need more help. There are those who are not registered who need more help. So I was urging the government to give more help and urging also the humanitarian community to do more in support of the government to make sure that they are properly treated. Because there are some quite severe problems there, particularly for the minority communities, the Afro-Colombian community and the indigenous communities who are there.
Is this a reaction to the idea put forth by several members of the Security Council that what happened today was a one-time only thing, that there is no future for Security Council involvement in this issue?
Well, I think that's a matter for the Security Council. I'm sure the President of the Council will say something about that in a minute.
But for the Secretariat, the Secretary General on Monday called for a suspension of fighting and for political discussions to bring about an end of the conflict. Is that the Secretariat's position, that there should be political before the end? Or I believe that you said in there after the fighting is over, then there should be political discussion.
Well, I think if the Secretary General said that, and I did say that, by definition that's the Secretariat's position. What I have said is that what is particularly important here is that if there is any chance of agreements for getting the civilian population out from the LTTE, then what's really important is that there should then be a temporary cessation of hostilities to allow them to leave safely, or a humanitarian corridor, or some combination of the two. That's the crucial point. Then there needs to be, as soon as the fighting stops, in whatever way it stops, and I hope it stops as soon as possible, and frankly, I don't mind how it stops. My concern from a humanitarian point of view is that it should stop as quickly as possible. Then there needs to be, obviously, a political process, which is not part of my mandate, but those underlying political problems need to be addressed to make sure the conflict doesn't recur.